Hi, I'm Ryan. I'm going to be teaching you how to use the new Unity input system for multiplayer games and fix a couple of bugs, particularly around using multiple player prefabs and instantiating objects from the player. So first, we need to set up the input system by going to our package manager and looking for the Unity registry. And then we're going to search for input system and then hit the install button. You may have to restart Unity when you do this. Now that we have the input system installed, we're going to set up our player prefab. For this example, I'm just going to use a 2D sprite. And the first thing I'm going to add is the player input component. And I'm going to hit create actions. This is an important part that you're going to have to do with the first setup. This is how we map actions, kind of like the input menu from the project settings in the old system. Here we can see we have 3 different action types. We've got the move, look, and fire. It's the default actions under the player. We're going to be using the move and fire today. Next, we'll want to add a player script to our object. This is where we're going to be handling the input that we receive. And then we're going to turn this object into a prefab, giving it a name and putting it into our assets folder. And then on our player input component that we added at the beginning, we want to set up the actions there. You should only have one option, that actions asset that we created. Now let's remove our player prefab from the scene and add a new empty object. And on this, we're going to add the component player input manager. This is what's going to allow us to have multiple players. And in that player prefab slot, put in the player prefab that we created. And if we go ahead and play the game now, we'll see that when you give an input, either on a controller or keyboard that's mapped in our actions, it'll create a new character. Back in our player prefab, we're going to change the player input behavior to invoke Unity events, and then open up our player script in Visual Studio or whatever code editing software you're using with Unity. In our script, we need to add code to handle input from the input system. So we'll need to add Unity using Unity engine.input system up at the top, and then create functions that can receive input from the system. We're going to be creating functions for the move and shoot inputs, and both of these functions are going to be taking in an input action.callback context. These functions are going to be called anytime the input is changed, so we want to make sure we're using them properly in the context, because that context is going to be more than just the value of the input. So for the move, it's pretty straightforward because we do just want the value regardless of how it's changed, so we can just read the value. For shooting, we only want to get the input press, so for that we can use context.started to check if this is the input where the button has been pressed. And then for move, we're just going to store the value of whatever the last input was, and then on update, translate our character based on our last input value. Next, I'm going to make a new prefab called bullet. It's just going to be a 2D circle sprite and a bullet script I'm going to make, and I'm just going to scale down the prefab a little bit so it's smaller than the player. Over in that bullet script, I'm just going to have it run a transform.translate on the update so that it will move away as soon as it's instantiated, and I'll give it a speed and multiply its direction by that speed and time.delta time to make it frame rate independent. Back in the player prefab, I'm going to open up the events under the player input, and then go to the player events and add events for the move and fire, with the object being the player prefab, and the function being the move and shoot functions that are on the player script we created. On the player script, we want to set the speed equal to something, and the bullet value to that bullet prefab, and on our bullet prefab, we want to set the speed in there as well. Now if you go in and test, Pressing an input on either the keyboard or the controller should spawn in a character that can move around and shoot, but you may notice with the first player, the bullet gets fired twice, once from the player and once from the spawn position, generally not with the second player, but we will be fixing this later in the tutorial. Now we're going to add support for multiple player prefabs. So we'll start by duplicating our current player prefab and changing some settings like the sprite color and the speed, just show a difference between the two prefabs. Then we're going to create this character switcher script. This will store our different prefabs and change the active prefab on the manager each time a new character is spawned. Add the character switcher script to the game object with the player input manager, and add your player 1 and player 2 prefabs to the list of prefabs on the script. And in the player input manager, change the notification behavior to invoke Unity events. And on the first event, the player joined event, you want to set the object to the same game object that it's on, and then set the function to the character switcher switch next spawn character. Now when we go to test, it will spawn in a random prefab of either the player 1 or player 2 each time a new player joins. It's still going to have the multiple bullet spawning issue. And it's also going to have another issue here, which is we see the player 2 is fine, but on the player 1, the player input, it's now missing its actions on the prefab. So if we go to try it again, when that player 1 spawns in, it's not going to be able to move or shoot. So we'll fix this issue and the extra bullet in the next section. The last script we're going to add is the player input handler. Just like our player script used to, this will take in input functions for move and shoot. So it's going to be using the Unity engine.input system, but it's also going to have a start function that instantiates a player prefab, just like our old character switcher script did. It's going to pick a random player prefab from a list that we can give the script. In our move and shoot functions, we're going to check that the player has actually been instantiated, and this will prevent any shots from being fired on players that have not yet been created. So it's going to fix that extra player bug we were getting before. We have the extra shot at the spawn point. And since we've moved our input to this player input handler script, we need to go back to our player script and change its move and update, or move and shoot, to not take input from the input system anymore, but to just get functions that are called from this player input handler script. Back in Unity, we're going to remove the player input components from our player 1 and player 2 prefabs, because they will now be just on the base player that we're going to create. So we're going to create a new prefab here. It's just called player. And on this, we're going to add the player input and our new player input handler script. And in the prefabs list on our player input handler, we can put in 2 and put in our player 1 and player 2 prefabs that it has to choose from. And on the player input, we can give it the input actions asset. On the game object with our player input manager, we can remove our character switcher script, since that's going to be handled in the player prefab, which is what we can make our new prefab for the player input manager. And we want to change the notification behavior back to send messages, since it doesn't need to do anything to switch the character prefab anymore. Lastly, we just need to set up our base player prefab now, just like we had our players 1 and 2 before, with the player input, that's behavior set to invoke Unity events, setting the player move and fire, setting the object to this player prefab, with the functions being the move and shoot functions on our player input handler script. And that's it. We now have a multiplayer game using the new Unity input system that can support multiple prefabs and can instantiate objects such as projectiles without activating on the uninstantiated prefab.